So picture this. It's a Tuesday morning, right?
Okay, Tuesday morning.
Yeah, and you're standing on the sidewalk outside your local bank branch. But you're not alone.
Right.
There's this massive line of people stretching entirely around the block. The mood is like super tense. People are frantically checking their phones.
Oh, man.
Right. Rumors have been swirling on social media since like Sunday night that the bank made some incredibly bad bets in the real estate market.
Yeah. Panic mode.
Exactly. So you pull out your phone, you open your banking app, and you hit refresh. But the screen just spins.
Uh-oh.
And then an error message pops up. And in that exact second, this cold realization just washes over you. The money you thought was sitting safely in a vault, it just isn't there.
Yeah. It is, it's the ultimate nightmare scenario in modern economics.
It really is.
A bank run. The exact moment where all that trust just evaporates and the mathematical illusion of modern banking is laid bare for everyone on the street to actually see.
Right. And it is an illusion, isn't it? I mean, we tend to think of banks as these giant, impenetrable piggy banks.
Yeah, exactly.
Put your paycheck in, and it just sits there waiting for you. But that is fundamentally not how banking works.
No, not at all.
And to understand what we're diving into today, we have to start with the actual mechanics of what a bank does every single day.
Right. Because the core function of a commercial bank is something called maturity and liquidity transformation.
Okay, maturity and liquidity transformation.
Yeah, which I know sounds incredibly technical,
It does.
but it's actually quite simple and honestly quite terrifying if it's left unchecked. So a bank takes in short-term, highly liquid deposits.
Right. Like my checking account.
Exactly, your checking account. You can walk in at any moment on any given day and demand all your cash back immediately.
Yeah, it's highly liquid, available on demand.
Right. But the bank doesn't just, hold on to that cash. I mean, it needs to make a profit.
Right.
So it takes your short-term deposit and it lends it out as a long-term, highly illiquid asset.
Oh, okay.
For example, a 30-year mortgage to your neighbors so they can buy a house, or, a massive 10-year loan to some corporation to build a factory.
So they are essentially borrowing short and lending long.
Precisely. It is this inherent fundamental asset-liability mismatch.
Wow.
The bank mathematically cannot refund every single depositor at the exact same time because that money is currently tied up in the concrete of your neighbor's foundation.
Right, you can't just liquidate a house in 5 minutes.
Exactly. If everyone shows up at once demanding their cash, the bank collapses. That is maturity transformation. It's the whole engine of global economic growth, but it is also a recipe for a systemic crash if the bank isn't managed with absolute pinpoint precision.
Which brings us to the entire mission of our deep dive today.
Yeah.
Because today we are doing something a little unique. We are going to act as expert academic researchers and instructional designers for you, the insanely curious learner.
Yes, we are.
If you have a major exam coming up or you just want to totally master this topic, we are going to mentally construct a highly detailed text-based blueprint for an infographic based on Chapter 8, Supervision of Commercial Banks.
It's going to be exhaustive.
Oh, totally. Our promise is that if you master this audio blueprint, you will never need to reread the chapter.
Exactly.
But before we dive into the actual sections of this infographic, we need to clear up one major thing, because I think people use these words interchangeably all the time.
Oh, regulation and supervision.
Yes. The difference between regulation and supervision.
It's honestly the most common misconception. People think, financial regulation covers everything, but it doesn't.
Right.
Regulation and supervision are two entirely different phases of governance.
Well, the way I was wrapping my head around this in the notes was with a highway analogy.
Okay, let's hear it.
Think of regulation as the speed limit sign on the interstate, right? The highway authority surveys the road, looks at the curves, and decides, okay, the maximum safe speed here is 65 miles per hour. They rate the rule book.
Yeah.
It applies to everyone uniformly. It is entirely static. But supervision is the highway patrol officer sitting in the cruiser in the median with a radar gun.
I love that.
Right. That officer is looking specifically at your car. They are checking your specific speed, your tires, watching if you are swerving, maybe even looking up your driving history.
That is a perfect way to visualize it.
Yep.
Regulation lays down the system-wide rules of the game. It's the legislative framework.
Okay.
But supervision is the dynamic, real-time enforcement of those rules at the individual entity level.
So it's personalized.
Exactly. And crucially, Supervision tailors the intensity of that enforcement to the specific risk profile of the entity.
So sticking with the analogy, the officer might just ignore someone going 66 miles per hour in a safe, modern sedan,
Yeah.
but they would immediately pull over a massive, fully loaded 18-wheeler with ball tires going the exact same speed because the risk profile is completely different.
Precisely. And the ultimate objective of that supervision is to protect depositors and preserve broader financial stability.
Right.
Because the reason the rule book alone, regulation, just isn't enough is because a static rule book cannot predict human behavior in real time.
Yeah.
Especially when billions of dollars are on the line.
Okay, but let me push back on that for just a second.
Sure.
If we write a good enough rule book, why do we need the expensive, invasive highway patrol? If the rules are totally clear, say a bank must hold a certain percentage of cash in reserve at all times, why can't we just trust the banks to follow the map? I mean, they have giant compliance departments, right?
They do, but it's because the environment they operate in is incredibly dynamic. And systemic risk builds up in ways a static rulebook simply cannot anticipate.
Okay.
The research actually points to systemic risk building up across two specific dimensions: the time dimension and the cross-sectional dimension.
All right, let's unpack this. Let's make this section 1 of our mental infographic core concept and title.
Perfect.
So for the title of the infographic, let's call it The Watchdog's Lens: Navigating the Supervision of Commercial Banks.
Catchy. I like it.
And the 2-sentence summary for the top of the graphic. While regulation lays down the system-wide rules of the game, supervision enforces these rules at the individual entity level, with the intensity tailored to the entity's specific risk profile.
Nice.
And sentence 2. The ultimate objective is to protect depositors and preserve broader financial stability by ensuring banks safely manage the inherent vulnerabilities of maturity and liquidity transformation.
That is an exam-ready summary right there.
Thank you. Okay, so underneath that, let's list those dimensions you just mentioned. Start with the time dimension. What is that?
Well, the time dimension is all about procyclicality.
Procyclicality. Okay.
Yeah. It's basically the psychological and economic momentum of the market.
Gotcha.
So during an economic boom, when times are good, asset prices are rising, and everyone just feels rich, banks naturally want to lend more.
Sure. Everybody's optimistic.
Right. They take on more debt, they increase their leverage, their risk appetite just naturally expands. Now, the rules might say they are technically compliant.
Okay.
But the overall system is quietly becoming dangerously bloated with risk. And then, when the inevitable bust happens, that massive buildup of debt severely amplifies the crash. A static rulebook can't easily regulate the exuberance of a boom market.
Oh, I see. It's kind of like everyone at the party deciding to have, just one more drink because the music is so good.
Exactly.
The rulebook says don't drive drunk, but supervision is the designated driver actively taking the keys away before midnight.
That is exactly it. Now, the cross-sectional dimension is about interconnectedness at any given point in time.
Interconnectedness. Okay.
It's the reality that banks, they don't operate in a vacuum. They lend to each other.
Yeah.
They hold each other's debt. They rely on the exact same payment clearinghouses. So if one massively interconnected institution makes a fatal error and collapses, that failure spills over and contaminates dozens of other healthy banks.
Wow.
A static rule book regulating Bank A doesn't help when Bank A is destroyed by the collapse of Bank B. That requires an active supervisor constantly monitoring the whole web of connections.
Okay, which perfectly sets up the International Monetary Fund's framework, which we definitely need on this infographic.
Yes, the IMF framework.
The notes mention the IMF laid out 5 specific pillars of what they call good supervision.
He did.
So if we're going to rely on human supervisors rather than just a rule book, what exactly must those supervisors be doing?
Well, the IMF's 5 pillars are fascinating because they're really as much about institutional psychology as they are about finance.
Oh, really?
Yeah. So the first pillar is that good supervision must be intrusive.
Intrusive. That is a strong word. I mean, nobody likes an intrusive boss, let alone an intrusive government regulator.
No, they really don't. But a hands-off approach simply does not work in banking. Intrusive means the supervisor demands a thorough, deep, granular understanding of the bank's business model.
So they're really getting in the weeds.
Exactly. They aren't just looking at the final balance sheet. They're looking at the risk culture of the employees, the governance structure of the board of directors, and the actual mechanics of how the bank makes its money.
They are inside the machine.
Totally inside the machine.
Okay, what's pillar 2?
Good supervision must be skeptical, but proactive.
Skeptical.
Right. Supervisors must actively question a bank's actions and narratives, even in good times.
Oh,
Honestly,
yeah.
especially in good times.
Why especially then?
Because when a bank says, hey, we found a brand new, highly profitable way to package mortgages, the supervisor's default stance should be skepticism, not celebration. They cannot take anything for granted.
I love that. Skeptical even when the profits are rolling in, because that's exactly when that time dimension, the procyclical risk, is building up behind the scenes.
Precisely.
Okay. Pillar 3.
Third, it must be comprehensive. Supervisors cannot just look at the core traditional banking operations.
Right.
They have to encompass all the subsidiaries, the brokerage arms, the wealth management divisions, the off-balance sheet vehicles, because history tells us that fatal risk almost always emanates from the periphery, not the core.
Oh, that makes sense. Because if the core bank is heavily regulated, they'll just create a side hustle subsidiary to take all the crazy bets.
Exactly.
Mm-hmm.
The supervisor has to shine a flashlight into every single dark corner of the corporate umbrella.
Right. Okay. Pillar 4.
The fourth pillar is that supervision must be adaptive. Financial innovation moves incredibly fast.
Oh, yeah, totally.
I mean, we go from paper ledgers to complex derivatives to algorithmic trading to cryptocurrency. If the supervisors are still using the tools from 10 years ago, they're entirely blind.
Right.
They must continuously upgrade their skills and their technology to spot emerging novel risks.
And the final 5th pillar.
It must be conclusive.
Inclusive.
Yeah, and this is really where the rubber meets the road. Supervisors have to actually follow through. I mean, identifying a risk is meaningless if you don't force the bank to fix it.
Right.
Supervisors must ensure their findings are actually taken to a logical conclusion, up to and including penalizing management or severely restricting operations.
Okay, so intrusive, skeptical, comprehensive, adaptive, conclusive.
That's the 5.
But the IMF framework actually adds a foundational layer underneath those 5 pillars, right? Like 2 supporting concepts that make the whole thing work.
Yes, the ability to act and the will to act.
Okay, explain the difference between those 2.
So the ability to act is structural.
Structural.
Yeah. Does the supervisory body have the clear legal statutory authority to walk into a bank and demand documents? Do they have an adequate budget?
Ah.
Do they have a highly trained, skilled staff who can actually understand the complex financial engineering the banks are doing? If they don't have the legal teeth or the budget, they have no ability to act.
That makes sense. But the will to act sounds, I don't know, much more psychological.
It is entirely psychological.
Yeah.
And political. The will to act is about having true operational independence.
Okay.
It is the courage to actually enforce the rules and take away the punch bowl when the party is just getting started.
Right.
It's incredibly unpopular to walk into a bank that is making record profits, employing thousands of people, driving the stock market higher, and tell them they have to stop what they are doing just because you, the supervisor, perceive some long-term risk.
Right, because politicians will yell at you, the media will criticize you.
Exactly. The will to act is the backbone required to withstand all that pressure.
Okay, I hear all of this, but let me introduce a major philosophical problem here for our infographic.
Okay, bring it on.
The text explicitly points out that commercial banks have an implicit backing from the government. We all know about deposit insurance, where the government guarantees everyday checking accounts up to a certain amount.
Yeah, the FDIC in the U.S., for example.
Right. And we also know that central banks act as a lender of last resort to provide emergency cash if a bank faces a run.
Yes.
But if the banks know, and the executors know, and the shareholders know, that the government will ultimately step in and save them to prevent a total economic collapse, doesn't that inherently encourage them to act recklessly?
Oh, absolutely.
It sounds exactly like going to Las Vegas and playing with the house's money. Like, if I win the bet, I keep the profits. If I lose the bet, the taxpayer covers my losses.
You have literally just articulated the single most dangerous concept in modern finance. It is called moral hazard. And the source material explicitly validates your exact concern.
Moral hazard, because the hazard is created by the safety net itself.
Exactly. Because banks enjoy that systemic safety net, and because their executives are often compensated based on short-term profits rather than long-term stability, there is a natural inherent temptation to take on excessive risk. The upside is privatized, meaning the bank keeps the profits. But the downside is socialized, meaning society bears the cost of a bailout. That dynamic can lead directly to the impairment of a bank's balance sheet.
So tying this all together for Section 1, the reality of moral hazard is precisely why supervision must be so intensely intrusive.
Exactly.
You simply cannot give a private, for-profit institution a taxpayer-funded safety net and then just look the other way while they make bets. The intrusion is the price they pay for the safety net.
That is the grand bargain of the modern financial system. Without the intrusive supervision, the moral hazard would just destroy the economy in a matter of months.
All right, so we understand the philosophical stakes. That's section 1 done. Now let's move to section 2 of our infographic blueprint, timeline and chronology.
I love a good timeline.
How did we actually get here? I want to trace the historical sequence of how supervision evolved, particularly looking through the lens of the Reserve Bank of India, the RBI.
The RBI provides an incredible case study for this.
Right, because it shows how a developing, massively complex economy wrestled with these exact problems. So if we go way back, pre-1990s, what did bank supervision look like? But this is the first bullet on our timeline.
Okay, pre-1990s, it was a very different world. Supervision was really just an adjunct to regulation. It wasn't its own distinct discipline.
Okay.
And it was intrusive, but not in the way the IMF meant. It was intrusive in a purely administrative micromanagement sense.
What does micromanagement actually look like for a central bank?
Well, it meant the regulator was deeply involved in the day-to-day business decisions of the banks. They were focused on strict licensing requirements. They were literally administering and dictating the exact interest rates banks could charge on loans or offer on deposits.
Wow, really?
Yeah, they were focused on the pricing of services. It was a heavy-handed, compliance-based approach that cared way more about whether a bank was following the exact administrative edicts rather than assessing the actual underlying financial risk of the loans they were making.
So they were basically making sure the paperwork was filed correctly, but not asking if the business model was actually sound.
Precisely. But that began to shift internationally. Our next timeline bullet is 1988, with the evolution of the Basel Accord.
1988, Basel Accord.
Got it. This was a gathering of global central bankers in Basel, Switzerland, attempting to create a unified benchmark for capital adequacy. It was the first real global attempt to say, hey, regardless of where your bank is located, you need to hold a certain minimum amount of capital as a buffer against losses.
But the real catalyst for change in India didn't happen because of a meeting in Switzerland.
No, it didn't.
It happened because of a severe crisis at home. Next bullet, 1991.
The 1991 balance of payments crisis in India, this was an absolute watershed moment.
What happened?
The country essentially ran out of foreign exchange reserves and was right on the brink of defaulting on its international obligations. This macroeconomic near-death experience triggered massive, sweeping economic reforms.
And how did that ripple into banking supervision specifically?
Well, the crisis exposed the fact that the old micromanagement approach was strangling growth, and it was masking massive inefficiencies and risks in the banking sector. The government and the RBI realized they needed to shift away from micro-level intervention and move toward a broad-based prudential approach. Instead of telling banks exactly what interest rate to charge, they needed to focus on the overall health and capital buffers of the institutions.
Which leads to a massive structural change. Next bullet point on the timeline, December 1993.
December 1993.
The notes detail that a completely new department, the Department of Supervision, or the DOS, was explicitly carved out of the existing Department of Banking Operations and Development, the DBOD.
Yes. This is a critical structural milestone.
But why carve it out? Why create a whole new department? I mean, it's all the same central bank, right?
To formally and physically segregate the supervisory role from the regulatory functions. It was a structural acknowledgement of what we discussed earlier with the speed limit and the highway patrol.
Right.
Making the rules and enforcing the rules require completely different structures, different skill sets, and totally different mindsets. The regulators need to think like architects. The supervisors need to think like detectives. You really can't have the architect also acting as the detective.
That makes perfect sense. And they doubled down on that a year later. Next bullet. November 1994, they set up the Board for Financial Supervision, the BFS.
Right. The BFS was established as a dedicated subcommittee of the Central Board of the RBI. The mandate was to provide dedicated, focused, and integrated supervision of all credit institutions, banks, financial institutions, and non-banking financial companies.
So they were centralizing the ultimate supervisory authority into one specialized board.
Exactly.
Okay, so the domestic architecture in India is being rapidly modernized in the mid-90s, and then the global standards get an upgrade. Let's add September 1997 to the timeline.
Yes.
The Basel Committee, which we mentioned earlier, publishes something called the Core Principles for Effective Banking Supervision.
The BCBS, the Basel Committee on Banking Supervision, is the premier international standard-setting body. And the publication of these core principles was huge. It gave every country a globally agreed-upon benchmark, a ruler by which they could measure their own domestic supervisory systems.
Okay.
It laid out exactly what a supervisor needs to be doing to be considered credible on the world stage.
Awesome. So by the late 90s, we have a segregated Department of Supervision, a dedicated board for financial supervision, and global benchmarks from Basel.
Yeah.
It sounds like everything's perfectly set up. The system is totally safe.
You'd think so, wouldn't you?
Yeah. But then we jump a decade forward on our timeline, 2007 to 2009.
The global financial crisis.
The GFC.
The ultimate stress test.
Oh, wow.
And the system failed catastrophically. The entire global economy went into a tailspin, banks collapsed, millions of people lost their homes, and massive taxpayer bailouts were required.
Yeah, it was bad.
So if we had all these Basel rules and all these dedicated supervisory departments, how on earth did the 2008 crisis happen? That is the exact question every single central banker in the world had to ask themselves in the aftermath. The brutal realization was that simply having the rules was not enough.
Right.
The GFC brutally exposed the severe, fatal limitations of the style of supervision that was dominant at the time. Specifically, it exposed the failure of the compliance-based supervisory approach.
Okay, the compliance-based approach. We need to drill down into this because this is the pivot point of the entire history of modern banking.
It really is.
And it brings us to Section 3 of our infographic blueprint, key terminology and definitions, because the legacy system they were using was an acronym, CAMELS. Let's break down the ghost of supervision past. Bold the word CAMELS on our blueprint. What exactly was it?
So CAMELS was the global standard for on-site compliance-based supervision. And just a side note, its counterpart for foreign banks operating in the country was called KLCS. But sticking with CAMELS, it is an acronym that dictated exactly what a supervisor would look at when they walked into a bank.
Right, let's spell it out.
C stood for capital adequacy, A for asset quality, M for management, E for earnings, L for liquidity, and S for sensitivity or systems and control.
Okay, but honestly, that sounds pretty comprehensive. Capital, assets, earnings. What's the problem? Why did CAMELS fail to stop the 2008 crash?
To understand why it failed, you have to imagine how a CAMELS inspection physically worked.
Okay.
A team of supervisors would arrive at a bank. They would sit in a conference room, and the bank would wheel in literal boxes of ledgers and historical financial statements.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, and the supervisors would spend weeks checking the math. Did the bank have the required capital last quarter? Was the asset quality good 6 months ago? Did their earnings match their projections last year?
Wait, it's all in the past tense?
Exactly. CAMELS was entirely backward-looking and reactive. It was a point-in-time assessment based entirely on past data and lagging indicators. By the time a bank's earnings or asset quality began flashing red on a CAMELS report, the damage was already done.
The toxic loans were already written years ago.
Yes, the poison was already in the bloodstream.
Yeah. So CAMELS is literally like performing an autopsy to see what killed the patient, rather than doing preventative medicine to stop the heart attack in the first place.
That's entirely accurate. The 2008 crisis proved that looking at lagging indicators could not catch the complex, rapidly evolving, and highly interconnected risks building up in the time and cross-sectional dimensions we discussed earlier.
Right.
Countries that were operating under the exact same Basel standards had vastly different outcomes during the crisis.
Right.
And the realization was that the quality and forward-looking nature of supervision was the actual differentiator between survival and collapse.
Okay, so the autopsy proved the old system was deeply flawed. Let's hop back to our Section 2 timeline for a second to log the response. Next bullet, August 2011. How did the regulators respond?
In India, the response coalesced in August 2011. The RBI constituted a high-level steering committee to entirely review and overhaul the supervisory processes.
And this lets us jump into Section 4 of our infographic, important figures and names, because we need to name the architect of this overhaul. Bold the name, Dr. K.C. Chakrabarty.
Yes. Dr. K.C. Chakrabarty's contribution to modern banking supervision literally cannot be overstated.
Really?
Yes. He was the figure who looked at the wreckage of the global financial crisis and recognized that India needed to fundamentally shift away from the outdated compliance-based CAMELS model.
Let's talk about the friction involved in what Dr. Chakrabarty was attempting to do. Because it's one thing to write a new rule. It's an entirely different thing to turn around a massive institution with decades of entrenched culture.
Oh, the resistance must have been incredible.
Right. You were asking thousands of supervisors who have spent their entire careers checking boxes and looking at historical ledgers to suddenly become risk forecasters. You're changing the entire culture of the central bank from a checklist mentality to a complex, forward-looking risk assessment mentality.
It was a monumental undertaking. It required rebuilding the entire data infrastructure of the RBI, retraining thousands of personnel, and completely changing the dialogue between the regulator and the banks. It was a shift from asking, "What did you do last year?" to asking, "What are you planning to do tomorrow, and how are you controlling the risks of that plan?"
And the result of the Chakrabarty Committee's work becomes reality starting in 2013. Let's put that on the Section 2 timeline, 2013 onwards. This is the birth of the modern era, the implementation of risk-based supervision across scheduled commercial banks in a phased manner.
Yes.
It was the death knell for camels.
Yes. Risk-based supervision, or RBS. Let's add that to Section 3. Definitions. This is the defining philosophy of modern financial oversight.
Define RBS for us. What is the fundamental mechanism?
RBS is defined as an ongoing, continuous, and highly forward-looking process. The supervisors are constantly assessing the inherent risks of a bank's business model to design specific, highly customized supervisory plans. But crucially, the defining feature of RBS is about resource allocation.
Resource allocation. You mean like where the RBI actually spends its time and money?
Exactly, because supervisory resources, the budget, the number of hours in a day, the number of highly skilled financial analysts the RBI employs are inherently scarce.
Right, you can't be everywhere at once.
No, you cannot comprehensively audit every single transaction of every single bank every single day. The RBS model was adopted to identify exactly where the material risks actually lie within the entire banking system, ensuring the optimal allocation of those scarce resources to the highest risk areas.
So under the old camel system, it was just one size fits all.
Yeah.
A massive, globally interconnected, trillion-dollar multinational bank got the exact same basic checklist approach as a tiny, localized cooperative bank operating in 2 rural towns.
Which is an absurd waste of resources, right?
Okay.
Because a localized cooperative bank failing doesn't trigger a global systemic crash. But under RBS, the supervisors use a differentiated proportional approach. The intensity of the supervision is directly calibrated to the entity's specific risk profile and its systemic importance. Resources follow the risk.
Resources follow the risk. That makes so much intuitive sense.
It does.
And within the RBI, this specific RBS framework was given a customized name. Let's add this bold term to our Section 3 definitions, SPARC.
Yes, SPARC. S-P-A-R-C. It stands for the Supervisory Program for Assessment of Risk and Capital.
SPARC entirely replaced camels. And as we transition from understanding camels to understanding SPARC, let's dictate an audio table for Section 7 of our infographic blueprint, the comparative matrix. Let's contrast the old model versus the new model.
I think that's incredibly useful for exam prep.
Let's do it category by category. So Model 1 is camels, a compliance-based approach. Model 2 is SPARC, the risk-based approach. Let's start with the primary focus of each model.
Okay. Under the camels model, the primary focus was strictly on checking boxes for regulatory compliance and assessing the current financial condition of the bank based on static balance sheets.
But under the SPARC model, the primary focus shifts entirely. It's about discovering material risks before they manifest, assessing the quality of the bank's internal risk controls, and, critically, evaluating the bank's underlying risk culture and governance.
Exactly. Next category is the time perspective. As we discussed, Camels was entirely reactive. It was point in time, backward-looking, and relied heavily on lagging indicators like historical earnings or past non-performing assets.
While SPARC is inherently proactive, it is dynamic, forward-looking, and relies on leading indicators. It tries to spot the trouble before it hits the balance sheet.
Perfect. Category 3 is the application method. Camels was fundamentally a one-size-fits-all model. Every single bank got the same basic treatment.
But SPARC uses a differentiated, highly proportional approach. The scrutiny scales at the complexity and the danger of the institution.
Which ties directly into Category 4, resource allocation. Because of its uniform nature, Camels demanded a uniform allocation of supervisor time across all entities, literally wasting time on low-risk banks.
Whereas SPARC optimizes those scarce resources. It deploys intense on-site scrutiny only to the specific areas and specific banks where the risks are highest.
And the final, perhaps most important category in our matrix is risk evaluation. Under Camels, individual risks were viewed in total isolation.
What do you mean?
Well, credit risk was put in one box, market risk in another, operational risk in a third. The supervisor looked at them all separately.
Oh, but Spark recognizes the real world doesn't work in silos. Spark analyzes the complex interaction and compounding nature of multiple risks acting together. Like a market shock might trigger a liquidity crisis, which then triggers a credit default. Spark looks at the whole web.
Exactly. To summarize this entire matrix, I think your analogy from earlier is the best way to visualize it.
The smoke detector versus the thermal camera.
Yes. Candles is the traditional smoke detector on your ceiling. It is a necessary safety device, but it only goes off when the fire has already started and the room is actively filling with smoke. It's a lagging indicator of a disaster that is already underway.
Oh. Right, by the time you hear the alarm, your couch is on fire.
Exactly. But Spark is like installing a military-grade thermal imaging camera in the room. It doesn't wait for smoke. It looks into the walls and sees the electrical wires slowly getting hot. It spots the vulnerability before the spark even happens.
That's so cool.
And in a modern, high-speed, deeply interconnected global economy, where billions of dollars move at the speed of light, a smoke detector is simply too slow. You have to anticipate the heat.
I love that. Spark is the thermal camera for the financial system. Okay, back to Section 3, definitions. Because to make this thermal camera work, the RBI introduced a crucial human element. Bold this term, the SSM.
The Senior Supervisory Manager. Under the Spark framework, the SSM is a designated single point of supervisory contact for a specific bank within the RBI.
Why is single point of contact so important?
Because massive banks are sprawling bureaucracies, and central banks are also sprawling bureaucracies. Under the old system, a bank might get an inquiry from the Foreign Exchange Department of the RBI on Monday, an inquiry from the Credit Division on Tuesday, and an IT audit on Wednesday.
That sounds super fragmented.
It was. By designating an SSM, you eliminate multiple, confusing points of contact. And more importantly, you give one specific, highly trained individual the responsibility of continuously monitoring and deeply understanding the holistic risk profile of that specific bank. The SSM becomes the ultimate expert on that specific institution.
So they're like the dedicated detective assigned to the case. Okay, so we have the philosophy of Spark and we have the human element with the SSMs. But a thermal camera only works if it has data. Massive, real-time, high-quality data.
Yes.
And this brings us to the technological evolution of supervision.
Data is literally the lifeblood of risk-based supervision. You cannot anticipate the future without an incredibly granular understanding of the present.
Historically, the RBI used something called Osmos. Let's add that to Section 3.
All right, Osmos, the offsite monitoring and surveillance system. It was set up as a complementary tool to the physical on-site inspections. Its job was to collect periodic data returns from the banks.
But technology moves fast, and Osmos eventually became a legacy system. The notes mention a major upgrade happened incredibly recently. Let's add this to Section 3, too. In June 2023, Osmos was replaced by CIMS.
Yes, CIMS, the Centralized Information Management System. This was a massive upgrade to the digital infrastructure, acting as a new, high-speed centralized portal for collecting, processing, and managing all the various regulatory returns and data streams coming from the financial sector.
But the data gathering isn't just about the banks themselves, it's about the customers, specifically the massive corporate borrowers. And this is where we run into a major historical problem. It's called information asymmetry.
Oh, this was a massive issue.
Explain how a borrower could exploit the banking system before these modern data networks existed. Let's connect the dots here for Section 6, cause and effect relationships.
Okay, so imagine a massive, highly leveraged corporation wants to borrow $1 billion. They go to Bank A and ask for $250 million. Bank A looks at their balance sheet, thinks they're a decent risk, and approves the loan.
Okay, straightforward so far.
Then the corporation goes to Bank B, asks for another $250 million, and hides the fact that they just borrowed from Bank A.
Wow.
Then they go to Bank C and Bank D.
So they are secretly racking up $1 billion in debt, but each individual bank thinks they only owe $250 million.
Exactly. The borrower has all the information, and the banks are operating in the dark. That is information asymmetry. And when that massively over-leveraged corporation eventually goes bankrupt, it takes 4 different banks down with it, because none of them accurately understood the true risk profile of the borrower.
So how did the regulator solve that? Because the banks obviously couldn't solve it themselves, right? I mean, their competitors, they aren't going to just share their client lists.
Right. The regulator solved it by forcing transparency. Because borrowers were actively exploiting this information asymmetry, the RBI created an entirely new database.
And here is a vital stat for Section 5 of our blueprint. June 2014. That's the date this database launched. What's the acronym for Section 3?
CRILC LC.
CRILC.
Yes, the Central Repository of Information on Large Credits.
That is a very literal acronym.
It does exactly what it says on the tin. CRILC mandated that banks must report the credit data of all their large borrowers into this central database.
Right.
Suddenly, the darkness was lifted. If that corporation went to Bank B could just pull the CRILC report and instantly see, wait a minute, you just borrowed $250 million from Bank A yesterday. Your leverage is way too high. Loan denied? It mitigated the information asymmetry and protected the entire system from unseen, overlapping exposures.
So it's basically a highly advanced credit score system, but for massive corporate loans.
Pretty much.
And speaking of bad actors, borrowers hiding debt isn't the only problem. Outright fraud is a massive risk.
Huge risk. Which is why, let's add this to Section 5. On January 20, 2016, the RBI operationalized the Central Fraud Registry, or the CFR. Add CFR to Section 3.
How exactly does the CFR work?
It is a web-based, highly searchable database of frauds reported by commercial banks. Before the CFR, a sophisticated ring of fraudsters could run a complex loan scam at a bank in Mumbai, extract the cash, disappear, and then run the exact same scam a month later at a different bank in Delhi.
Because the two banks weren't talking to each other.
Exactly. They weren't communicating about the specific tactics of the fraud. The CFR acts as a real-time warning system. Banks upload the details of the frauds, the names of the individuals, and the specific mechanisms used. It stops fraudsters from moving undetected from one institution to another.
So we have CRILC stopping the secret overborrowing and CFR stopping the serial fraudsters. But as the decade progresses, the nature of the threat fundamentally changes. We aren't just dealing with bad loans or paper frauds anymore. We are dealing with code.
The digitalization of finance. This brings a whole new category of systemic risk, operational risk via cyber threats.
And we can track the regulator's response to this through a series of key dates and figures. Let's add to Section 5 vital statistics. June 2015. Recognizing the growing threat of hackers and digital vulnerabilities, the RBI established a dedicated cybersecurity and IT examination cell.
CSIA. This was a formalization of the fact that a bank's firewall is now just as important to systemic stability as its capital reserves. If a major bank gets hacked and its core ledger is corrupted, the panic is instantaneous.
Definitely. Then let's go back to Section 4, important figures. In 2018, we see the formation of the Inter-Regulatory Working Group on FinTech and Digital Banking, chaired by Sri Sudarshan Sen.
Yes. This committee was crucial because it acknowledged that the landscape of finance was moving rapidly outside traditional bank branches and onto smartphones. They had to figure out how to supervise financial technology companies that were moving faster than the law.
And pushing even further into the modern digital era, in 2021, Sri Jayant Kumar Dash chaired the working group on digital lending. Let's add him to Section 4 as well.
Tackling the explosion of online lending platforms and mobile loan apps, these apps introduced entirely new consumer credit risks, data privacy concerns, and extremely aggressive recovery practices that required urgent supervisory focus.
It's just fascinating to trace these names in Section 4. If you look at S. Padmanabhan back in 1995, let's make sure we add him and Vipin Malik, who chaired the working group on consolidated accounting in 2001, and Semitat Shamala Gopinath, who convened the working group on financial conglomerates in 2004 anyway. If you look at Padmanabhan in 95, his committee was focused on how to physically conduct on-site inspections of paper ledgers.
Yeah, quite a job.
By 2011, Dr. Chakrabarty is redesigning the entire philosophy of risk management. And by the late 2010s, Sen and Dash are wrestling with fintech and smartphone apps. You can literally trace the evolutionary trajectory of the global economy just by looking at what these central bankers were assigned to study.
It perfectly proves the IMF's fourth pillar. Supervision must be intensely adaptive.
And adapting to the modern era means adopting modern workflow technology. Let's add a date to Section 5, October 6th, 2022. The RBI governor launches a new system. Let's put the acronym in Section 3, DAGSESH.
DAGSESH. It's the RBI's Advanced Supervisory Monitoring System. It's a web-based, end-to-end workflow application.
But what does that actually mean in practice? Like, what does DAGSESH do?
Well, imagine the sheer logistical nightmare of managing the supervision of dozens of massive commercial banks.
Oh, I can only imagine.
You're tracking thousands of compliance requirements, scheduling on-site inspections, monitoring remediation plans, and ensuring every single issue raised by an SSM is actually fixed by the bank. Historically, this involved endless email chains, random spreadsheets, and massive physical files.
Sounds like chaos.
It was. Dacash digitized and centralized that entire workflow. It creates a seamless digital trail of communication between the regulator and the regulated entity, ensuring absolutely nothing falls through the cracks and improving the overall compliance culture.
It's basically the ultimate project management software for preventing economic collapse.
Yes, exactly.
And alongside Dacash, the notes mention a specific framework targeting a very dark side of the financial system. Money laundering. Let's add this to Section 3 definitions. SACAR.
SACAR, the supervisory assessment of KYC and AML risks. KYC being know your customer and AML being anti-money laundering.
But why does this need its own specific framework? Isn't this just part of general supervision?
Because the risk of a bank being used to launder money for criminal syndicates or terrorist organizations is so severe and the penalties so catastrophic that it requires specialized focus.
Oh, right.
SACAR provides a risk-based supervisory focus, specifically tailored to a bank's business model and transaction volume. A bank doing high-volume international wire transfers in multiple currencies faces a massively different AML risk profile than a domestic bank strictly doing local mortgages. SACAR ensures the supervisory intensity matches that specific risk.
Okay, so we've built up this massive, proactive, tech-enabled thermal camera of a system on our blueprint. The SSMs are monitoring the Spark framework, pulling data from SIMs, checking CRILC for big loans, CFR for frauds, and running it all through Dacash.
That's a lot of acronyms working together.
It is, but what happens when the thermal camera actually spots a fire? What happens when a bank ignores the warnings and actually starts bleeding capital? Does the regulator just, send a strongly worded letter?
This is where we get to the sharpest teeth in the entire supervisory arsenal. Let's add this to Section 3, the Prompt Corrective Action Framework, PCA.
The PCA. This is where the will to act is actually codified into law.
Exactly. The PCA is a structured, rule-based early intervention framework. Its entire purpose is to take the emotion, the politics, and the hesitation entirely out of regulatory intervention.
How does it do that?
By establishing hard mathematical triggers. The PCA framework continuously tracks 3 specific vital risk indicators for every single bank.
Okay, let's list those 3 indicators for our Section 5 vital statistics. There are exactly 18 significant ratios tracked in the new Early Warning Indicators framework. But within the PCA itself, there are 3 main vital signs. What are they?
First is the CRAR, or the Common Equity Tier 1 ratio. This is essentially a measure of the bank's core capital cushion against its risk-weighted assets.
Okay, the capital cushion.
The second is the net NPA ratio, which is the level of non-performing assets or bad loans relative to their total advances.
Bad loans, got it.
And third is the Tier 1 leverage ratio, measuring exactly how much debt the bank is using to fund its assets.
Capital, bad loans, and leverage, the holy trinity of bank health. And for Section 5, note that the PCA framework defines exactly 3 risk thresholds for these indicators. Threshold 1, Threshold 2, and Threshold 3.
Right. And this is where your medical analogy from earlier becomes incredibly apt.
Oh, right. Imagine a patient hooked up to monitors in a hospital. If one of those 3 vital signs flashes red, let's say the patient's cholesterol, or in this case, the net NPA ratio, crosses Threshold 1, the alarms just go off.
And because it is rule-based, the intervention is automatic. If a bank breaches a threshold, mandatory restrictions instantly kick in. It's not a negotiation. It's like a doctor looking at a bad blood test and immediately legally restricting the patient's diet and activities.
Wow. What do those mandatory restrictions actually look like for a bank?
Well, the first thing to go is usually the dividends. The bank is legally prohibited from distributing profits to its shareholders.
Ouch.
Yeah. The logic is simple. If your bank is financially sick, you must conserve every single dollar of capital to heal the balance sheet. You absolutely cannot give that money away to investors.
Makes sense.
And as the bank crosses into threshold 2 or 3, the restrictions become intensely severe. The bank might be blocked from opening any new branches. They might be prohibited from entering new lines of business. They might even be restricted from issuing certain types of loans entirely, effectively halting their growth until they prove they can manage their existing risks.
It literally forces them to stop running, sit down, and heal. And because it's triggered automatically by the math, the supervisors don't have to fight a massive political battle to enforce it. The rules are the rules.
It acts as an incredibly powerful deterrent. Bank executives are terrified of being placed under the PCA framework, not just because of the operational restrictions, but because of the massive reputational damage. It is a very public signal that the bank is in trouble. So they work incredibly hard to manage their risks, to stay far, far away from those thresholds.
But the banking system is sneaky, right?
Very.
If the rules for commercial banks are this strict with PCA thresholds and C databases and intrusive SSMs, won't capital just try to find a way to escape the pressure cooker?
You just identified the final and perhaps most complex piece of the supervisory puzzle, the phenomenon of regulatory arbitrage.
Regulatory arbitrage. Let's really dig into this for Section 6. Cause and effect relationships, because this explains the most recent major structural shift in the RBI's history. Define regulatory arbitrage for me.
Well, capital and financial institutions behave a lot like water. They will always flow toward the path of least resistance, or in the financial world, the path of least regulation and the highest potential return.
Right, because strict regulation like holding lots of capital reserves, not taking crazy bets, that inherently lowers your profit margin.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Now imagine a scenario where the central bank has multiple fragmented supervisory departments.
Okay.
Let's say Department A supervises traditional commercial banks very strictly, applying the full weight of the Spark framework. But Department B supervises non-banking financial companies, NBFCs, or shadow banks with a slightly lighter touch.
Right.
And Department C supervises cooperative banks with different rules entirely.
And this was the actual reality for a long time, right? Different departments for different types of institutions.
Yes, it was heavily siloed. Now, the problem arises because of the evolution of the market. The financial system saw the rapid rise of massive, incredibly complex financial conglomerates. These are gigantic corporate holding companies that own a commercial bank and an NBFC and an insurance company and a brokerage firm, all operating under one giant umbrella.
Okay, I see exactly where this is going. If I'm the CEO of that conglomerate and I have a highly risky, incredibly profitable scheme I want to execute, I'm not going to run it through my commercial bank because Department A is watching me like a hawk with their thermal cameras.
Exactly. You simply shift the risky activity into your NBFC subsidiary because you know Department B is using an older, slower smoke detector. You are actively exploiting the gaps between the regulatory silos. That is regulatory arbitrage. The holding company executives are looking at the entire chessboard, but the regulators are only looking at their specific isolated squares.
The regulators have blind spots, and the conglomerates build their casinos perfectly inside those blind spots. So how did the RBI fix this? Because this sounds like a structural flaw that could bring down the whole system if an NBFC takes a massive hit that ripples back into the parent commercial bank.
And that exact fear is what drove a monumental reorganization for our Section 6 cause and effect mapping. Because these complex conglomerates were bridging multiple sectors, and because the risk of regulatory arbitrage was just too high, the RBI made a massive move.
This goes on our Session 2 timeline. The final bullet, November 2019. What happened?
They integrated all of their previously fragmented supervisory branches, the ones looking at commercial banks, non-banks, and cooperative banks, back into a single, unified, massive Department of Supervision, or DOS.
Bringing everyone under one roof.
Yes, the goal was to entirely eliminate the blind spots. By unifying the DOS, the RBI ensured that they could look at a massive financial conglomerate holistically. They could track the risk as it moved from the commercial bank to the NBFC to the wealth management arm without ever losing sight of it across departmental lines.
Wow.
It created a 360-degree panoramic view of systemic risk, effectively closing the loopholes that allowed for regulatory arbitrage.
It is a phenomenal story of evolution. I mean, when you map it all out on this blueprint, it follows such a clear, survival-driven logic. Every regulation, every new database, every structural reorganization was born from the pain of a crisis or the anticipation of a vulnerability.
From the micromanagement of the 80s to the massive shock of the 1991 crisis, from the failure of the reactive camel system in 2008 to the visionary pivot toward risk-based supervision by Dr. Chakrabarty.
Yeah.
The creation of CRIL to fight information asymmetry, and the unification of the DOS to fight regulatory arbitrage. It is the continuous, unending construction of a stronger, smarter safety net.
And to the insanely curious learner listening to this, you now hold the complete mental infographic blueprint of that safety net.
You're ready for the exam.
You understand the profound difference between the static rulebook of regulation and the dynamic, intrusive enforcement of supervision. You understand why the system works the way it does, not just what the acronyms stand for.
And honestly, the why is what matters. The why is what allows you to predict where the system will actually go next.
Which is exactly where I want to end this deep dive. Because the text we've been analyzing leaves a massive breadcrumb about the future. It briefly touches on the concept of subtech, supervisory technology.
Yes. the new frontier. The use of advanced supervisory analytics, leveraging artificial intelligence and machine learning.
The RBI has formed groups like ASAG, the Advanced Supervisory Analytics Group, to explore this. And we already see the foundations with the DAC-KSH system. But I want to take this to its logical conclusion and leave you, the listener, with a final provocative thought.
Let's hear it.
We spent a lot of time today talking about the IMF's pillars of good supervision, and specifically the foundational requirement of the human will to act, the courage for a human regulator to look at a bank CEO and say, stop.
It's the absolute hardest part of the job.
Now, fast forward 5 or 10 years. Imagine a world where algorithms and AI become the ultimate supervisors. They are ingesting millions of data points from SIMs, CRILC, and global markets instantly. They can process the compounding risks of the Spark matrix with cold mathematical precision. They don't have political biases, they don't care about the bank stock price, and they never sleep.
The ultimate thermal camera.
Exactly. But here's the question you need to mull over on your own. If an AI assumes the role of the primary risk forecaster, what happens to the human element of skepticism and judgment? Will the will to act be lost, or will it be amplified?
That's a great question.
Imagine the day an AI dashboard flashes bright red, and the algorithm tells a human supervisor that they must immediately invoke the most severe PCA restrictions on a massive, seemingly healthy, incredibly popular commercial bank, or else a systemic crisis will occur in exactly 30 days.
The human supervisor is looking out the window, the stock market is at record highs, everyone is happy, but the machine is saying the foundation is crumbling.
Does the human have the will to act on the word of a machine? Do they pull the plug on the economy because a black box algorithm told them to? Or do they hesitate, second-guess the AI, and let the disaster happen? As the technology evolves, the intersection of algorithmic precision and human courage is going to be the ultimate test of financial stability.
It is an incredibly daunting scenario, but it is undoubtedly the reality we are accelerating toward.
Something to think about the next time you open your banking app. Thank you for joining us on this incredibly expansive journey today. We took this massive, complex material and custom-tailored it just for you to help you understand the invisible architecture holding your world together. Keep questioning the systems around you, stay curious, and we will see you next time.